at all of the names. It's nice to see so many familiar faces and some members of the Yorkshire Historic Churches Trust. So this is the first of our winter series of Zoom talks, which we've done for the last couple of years. This year it's a slight change in that up till now we've talked only about churches in Yorkshire, but on this occasion Mike will be talking about churches a bit further away, but perhaps with some great links to Yorkshire anyway. So though I think most of you know the Yorkshire Historic Churches Trust, just a few words about it for people who don't know. We're a small charity founded in 1988 with the aim of raising money to help Christian churches and chapels throughout Yorkshire in the essential work of maintaining their fabric. Last year in 2021, we gave a grant of over £115,000 to 28 Yorkshire churches. The grants were given to help them repair such things as the roofs, the stonework, the windows, the gutters, and even the bells. Our income comes for these grants comes from, first of all, one very generous patron, Terry Bramall, and for other charitable trusts and foundations, as well also as from members of the Yorkshire Historic Churches Trust, from bequests and from individual donors. If you'd like to know more about the Trust, go to our excellent website, which will give you plenty of information. And as a final commercial plug, these talks are free, they're open to everybody, so do please spread the word. But if you feel like making a donation, however small, it's always obviously very welcome. But so after the commercial, let's turn to the essential part of the evening. So I'd like to introduce Mike Stallybrass, whom many of you may already know. I met him through an excellent series of talks which he and his wife gave on church architecture, first in person pre-pandemic, and then during the lockdown by Zoom. And one of the talks that he gave was on Norwegian stave churches, about which I knew absolutely nothing. And I found it so interesting that I asked Mike if he would give a talk to all of you, and I'm sure you'll find it as interesting as I did. So over now to you, Mike, and we'll go, you can take over the screen share and we'll go to gallery view.
Right, well, I hope that you can now all see, and what I'm just going to do is to mute everybody before I start talking. There we are, so that's everybody is now muted. Well, as you may have already seen in the blurb, I'm half Norwegian and I travel a lot to Norway, and my wife and I spent nearly a month, it's now 7 years ago, traveling around Norway looking at many of their medieval churches. And by now I have actually seen all but one of the stave churches in Norway. So here we have one of the finest stave churches. It's actually the largest stave church in Norway at Heddal, complete with dragon heads and crosses on the roof. It was originally built round about 1200. But before I dive right into stave churches, I want to talk a little bit about Norway as a country and some of the other aspects which actually have influenced the church life in Norway. So Norway is a country now with a population of about 5.5 million. Roughly half of them live in the greater Oslo area. So you've got actually a very, very thinly populated country. From east to west, it may surprise you that the difference in sunrise time is just under 2 hours. The easternmost point of Norway is actually further east than Istanbul. 2/3 of the country is mountain plateau, cut by deep fjords. And from the north of Norway to the south of Norway, you've got nearly 1,500 miles, and there are 50,000 islands along the coast. Inland, travel was much more difficult than traveling by water in the fjords and along the coast. The dramatic waterfalls and rivers present challenges for many, many travelers and have kept much of Norway isolated until recent road building, where rather than having to go up and down these steep roads, there are some fantastic long tunnels. Norway has the longest road tunnels in the world. But I want to talk a little bit about how Christianity came to Norway as the backdrop to the churches. The church in Norway can actually, I think, be described as England's most important daughter church. The history of the early church in Norway is intertwined with English history. Missionaries from Northumbria and Ireland travelled from the 8th century on. And on the left, we've got an Anglo-Norse stone cross. This dates from about 850. There are roughly 60 such crosses known along the west coast of Norway, the earliest dated to just before 750. But not all the contacts between England and the Norsemen were good. So here I've got a gravestone on Lindisfarne following the famous raid by the Vikings in 793. The raiders looted the monastery for items of value. And here we have a reliquary which came from a grave just south of Trondheim, where we know that some of the raiders came from. The grave itself, dated about 800 AD, was found in 1906. This is a rather more recent find from a Viking woman's grave found in 1961. The grave has been dated to 820. And what we've got here is part of a crozier, originally thought to be Irish, but is now identified as coming from Northumbria, somewhere between 780 and 820. And here we've actually got another fantastic find. This is a gospel cover. The complete book cover is actually an exact fit for the Lindisfarne Gospels. And this has come from another grave, which was dated 810. It's known that the outer protective covers of the Lindisfarne Gospels were removed during that raid. And it is interesting to speculate whether any of these three items are actually treasures which were looted then. However, because of the current Norwegian law over looted antiquities, if any of these were proven to have come from Lindisfarne, they would actually have to be returned. I should add that while the first item is on public display, the last two items are not. England played an important part in the conversion of Norway, partly through King Athelstan, who acted as the foster father for Håkon the Good, who became the first Christian king of Norway. The first record of a wooden church being built in Norway dates from this time. Norway was finally proclaimed a Christian country in 1024 by Olaf Haraldsson, Olaf II, otherwise known as St. Olaf, a great nephew of Håkon the Good. And here we have 3 medieval wall paintings depicting St. Olaf, who was canonized shortly after his death in 1031. In 1024, the king summoned a ting of the whole of Norway, which met here at Moster. This stone church, dated to 1150, replaced an earlier wooden structure. And the ting declared Norway to be a Christian country and passed some ecclesiastical laws, including one to the effect that if a church was burnt down, the replacement must be consecrated within 12 months of the burning. Now, you don't pass such laws unless it was a commonplace. And it may well have been that Olaf, while he was converting Norway by the sword, he applied a certain amount of persuasion, and people who didn't wish to be converted, they had their farmsteads burnt down. So I cannot help wondering whether this burning in the Bio tapestry is actually of a church. Just look how it differs from the unburnt house to the right, including the dragons on the roof. Now, here we have our first link with Yorkshire. The Cistercian monks from Fountains Abbey built Lisa Closter, which is just south of Bergen, in 1145-46. It's one of the many daughter houses of Fountains, which was founded in 1132. Lisa Closter itself then had further daughter houses in Norway. Now, anyone who travels on the west coast of Norway in the summer will have passed numerous roadside stalls selling fruit. The monks from Fountains introduced the growing of apples, cherries, and raspberries to Norway. And there are now some 1,600 churches in Norway, including some stunning modern ones, but there are still nearly 200 medieval ones standing, mostly stone churches. So here I'm just putting up a timeline. First of some significant church events in green, and then some significant social events, these are in blue, and political events in purple. Note in particular the battles of Stamford Bridge and Hastings, the Black Death, the Anglo-Norse Treaty of 1217. This was actually the first ever free trade agreement in the world. And it's quite significant in terms of some of the valuable things which you find in the Norwegian medieval churches, because it provided for free transit of labour, exchange of labour between Norway and England, and also tax-free exchange of goods. A couple of other particular things. 1851, there was an act of parliament a Norwegian act of parliament, which required that churches must seat up to 30% of the population of the parish. And as many of the old wooden stave churches were not large enough, it resulted in a destruction of a lot of the churches. And here I've got something which you can see up the top here, the building of stone and wooden churches against the timeline. And the battles of Stamford Bridge and Hastings are very important because immediately after the Battle of Hastings, a significant number of English Saxon workers, stonemasons and other craftsmen decamped from England and went to Norway, and you suddenly see the start of the building of stone churches in Norway. And all the early medieval stone churches in Norway were built by English masons. But it's this yellow area up here where we had got the stave churches, which we're really interested in. And so I come to understanding what a stave church is. Let's just start. Once upon a time, there was a Stave Church. It stood in a small community called Fortune. Here is a photograph of it in 1873. But during that time, the idea of museums of historic buildings was born in Norway. And as the locals were happy to dispose of their tatty old wooden church, it was dismantled in 1883 and rebuilt in Fantoft Museum near Bergen. And by 1890, the church had been rebuilt, and it looked like this. Very, very different from the original. It was tweaked and modified a bit over the next 100 years, but held pride of place in the museum until Whitsunday in 1992. In the 90s, in Norway, there were a number of attacks on churches by death metal Satanist biker groups, and that night, the Fantoft church was burnt to the ground. Mercifully, the rebuild in the 1880s had been fully documented, and it was possible, using authentic techniques, to rebuild a full replica, which now stands in its place. Right, so I'm actually getting down now to the nitty-gritty of what is a Stave Church. In Norway, you will find there have been 4 different techniques for constructing churches out of wood. The earliest type is the palisade construction, where you have got a whole series of vertical timbers all sunk into the ground. Then they moved to post construction, where the corner posts are still sunk into the ground, but all the infill planking rests on a sill, on a horizontal sill. However, both of these methods of construction suffer from the problems of water wicking up through the base of the posts, and very rapidly these structures tend to rot. So to avoid this problem, you move to the stave method of construction, where you actually have all of the wood is raised above the ground and is resting on horizontal sills. And so here I'm actually looking at 2 Stave Church. The one in the middle is at Ringebu, and the one down in the bottom right-hand corner is at Eidsborg. And you can just see how the stave itself is twisted. And in many churches, you actually find that twisted staves were deliberately chosen because they have greater strength. The final method of construction which you find is log construction, where everything is laid horizontally. This is a method of construction which takes over after the Black Death, because log construction only requires 2 people to actually build. Now, when you go around Norway, there are 4 types of the form stave churches are being classified into 4 types, which you will find now. First of all, there is just a very simple construction where you have 4 corner posts. Then there is the Mura type, which is similar to the simple form, but there are external bracing and buttressing. It's quite an odd sort of construction technique. Then there's what's known as the mid-mast, where you have a central post in addition to the corner posts. The central post is supporting a belfry. And then finally, you have what's known as the raised central room type. This is the most complex, with many, many posts, And generally speaking, there's also a covered ambulatory around the central space. And so here we've got some pictures of the different sorts of construction. It is only on the raised central room stave churches that you have any examples of dragon heads on the roof. So here I've got an exploded drawing of one of the most famous stave churches, the one in Borgund, where you can see, quite how complex the method of construction actually is. And I'm sorry, I think that I've had a message sitting up in the middle of the screen for some of the time. I have just removed that. So here I am actually now looking up into the roof of one of the other stave churches. This is the stave church at Garmo. Not all wooden churches are in Norway. St Andrew's Church in Greenstead, Essex, has a link with Yorkshire, as the first church on this site was built by Cedd in 654, when he was abbot of Lastingham. And the remains of this and a second wooden church were found during excavations in the chancel in 1960. It is sometimes called the oldest stave-built church in the world. It's actually not a stave construction, but a palisade construction, and it's now sitting on a sill from a Victorian reconstruction in 1848. So I've talked a little bit about what a stave church is, so now I want to talk about where and how they were built. So I've got a map here showing Norway with the remaining stave churches plotted on the map. Up the top here, you have got a group of three, the Mura ones. The mid-mast ones, again, there's just three of those. They are down in sort of southern eastern Norway. And the majority of the stave churches are these types here, with either the simple or the raised central room. I talked about palisade and post churches, and we do know of a number of places where there were post churches in Norway. Some of them are actually earlier examples of churches on the site where a stave church now stands. But it is amazing how many of the stave churches have been lost. We think that there were over 1,000 built in the medieval period. 28 now remain, which represents only 2% of that initial build of churches. Compare that with the medieval stone churches in Norway. Of 270 which were known to have been built, 160 survive, representing a survival rate of 60% for stone, as opposed to 2% for wood. The tools used when building a stave church, the main tool was the axe. And here I've got some sketches from medieval manuscripts showing how workers trimmed the timbers. And we've also got some examples here of contemporary tools. Up the top, it's a whole set of reconstructed Viking tools from a site in Ribe in Denmark. And on the left, these are a museum at Hedalen stave church. And these are all farmers' axes dating from the 16th century. Incidentally, the porch of a church in Norway is called the Vappenhus. Literal translation is the weapon house, because everybody in Norway was compelled by law to actually carry a weapon, an axe or other fighting weapon with them, and it had to be left at the door when they entered church. The use of the axes can actually produce some quite interesting textures on the woodwork. And here we can see some of the working on the left in Haltdalen Stave Church, and the herringbone marks which you've got there are actually a sign of two axemen working together to shape the wood. And down on the right, I've got an example of some wood there, which has actually been finely shaped using a shave rather than an axe. But when you come to build one of the churches, the way that they were built was that actually each side wall was put together while it was down on the ground, and it was then erected. And you can see that raising a frame like that into the vertical position requires quite a lot of manpower. And I got some photographs here from experimental archaeologists at work. You've got Lom Stave Church there in the background. They were doing this some 14 years ago to actually see how what the effort was involved in building a stave church. But it's not just the structure, you've got quite a lot of wonderful decoration in as well. And in Torpo Stave Church, there's a sketch on a wall plank in the upper part of the nave, which appears to be a design for the intricate carvings on the south door. And I've got a photograph here of a craftsman with his tools who was actually reproducing that particular carving. Another place, this is a stave church which no longer exists as a stave church, but the portal is still in the Museum of Cultural History in Oslo. And I came across a school where they were doing for a Millennium project, reproducing one of the little panels from that left-hand door. And so they started with sketching out and then getting to the final work. It was absolutely lovely seeing what the school kids could do. Wood lasts a long time if it is well treated. And here we're looking at part of Borgund Stave Church, and you can see how thickly covered with tar the church actually is. However, tar is quite a inflammable material, and there have been a number of disastrous fires of wooden churches. Perhaps the worst was the one at Grue Stave Church in 1812, I think it was. I got it on the timeline earlier. The English word gruesome, I think, has largely come from the fire at Grue Stave Church, where over 100 people perished in the fire because the doors opened inwards into the church and people couldn't get out. It resulted in some of the first safety legislation in Norway. All doors in public buildings in Norway since that time must open outwards. Besides tarring to help preserve the timbers, the roof shingles do gradually wear away under the weight of the rain. They are eroded by rain. And we've come across two places where roof shingles were being replaced. one at Ringaby, and then at Borgund. You can see in that top right-hand picture quite how worn some of the roof shingles were before they were being replaced. And then sometimes you find that you need emergency repairs. This was inside the Stave Church at Ura. Just note the green man, well, actually, I should actually say there are two on that particular pillar. But sometimes it's even more drastic. Remember Hedal Stave Church, which I had as my cover photo. This was dilapidated when it was restored and saved in the 1850s. Now, at that time, there was increasing interest in preserving the churches from the past, but the solutions used in the restoration were poor, both technically and architecturally. And when completed, the restorations left little that suggested the original medieval structure. As a result, this particular church needed to be restored about 100 years later in the 1950s. And one of the few people left who remembers the rescue operation more than 70 years ago said, "I went to the Stave Church, but it was no longer there. It was just open land." The 96-year-old remembers the Stave Church being torn apart, and the material was then sorted. Then some of the building materials could be used again while other parts had to be newly crafted, as a new church arose in the site of the old. So I'm going to have a little bit of a round tour of some of the particular churches which excite me the most. And I'm going to start with Urnes, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. This church is actually the third one on the site. The oldest is thought to have been built shortly after the year 1000, and it was post, not stave construction. Then there was an earlier simple type of church here, Stave Church, built in about 1070. Dendrochronology has shown that some of the timbers of the current church were felled in 1129. Now, you approach the World Heritage Site by ferry. And then you've got, it's about a kilometre to walk up from the point where the ferry reaches the land. But I mentioned that there was an earlier church, and quite a bit of the timber of the earlier church has been used in the construction of the current one. So I've got a reconstruction drawing here of the earlier church from 1070, and you can see marked out in grey, in brown on the drawings of today's church, where there are timbers which have been reused from this earlier church. And the carvings on that earlier church were absolutely spectacular. So the portal of the original church is actually now part of the north wall. This would have been the west door. But the fine motifs are incredibly deeply cut. Clearly, the carvers were actually copying metalwork rather than woodwork originals. No wood carver would ever dream of carving things quite so thin and so deep. I mean, you've got a raised carving here, which is actually a couple of centimeters deep and incredibly thin. We were very lucky to be allowed inside to take photographs, because photographs is strictly forbidden. The official permit, which I'd had issued by the Norwegian government, was refused, but I then produced my reader's card from the University Library of Cambridge, and that produced immediate results. Inside, the wooden staves date from 1130. Looking east, you can see later cross-bracing as the structure had been altered to remove some of the bottom parts of some of the eastern staves to enable the building of a larger chancel. You can also see the lovely medieval candelabra that still light the church. There are some incredible treasures inside. Above the chancel arch is a wooden rood group from the late 1100s, repainted shortly after 1200. And all this carving here is thought to be English work. The beautiful Madonna, which came from Ernest, is now sadly in the Bergen Museum, but there are still a pair of Limoges candlesticks dated to 1220 in the church. And this is where the Anglo-Norse treaty comes in to prominence, because there was a surge of Limoges ware appears in Norway almost immediately after that treaty in 1217. In the chancel, the furnishings and the paintings date from the 16th century, although the longship style candlestick on the altar is earlier, as is the turned chair, known as the bishop's chair, but it was actually designed for hearing confessions. The original ironwork on the west door is amazing. You can see the raised areas where another lock face protected the wood from weathering. And for scale, you can see the key that fits that lock. And this lovely lassie locked us into the church while we were taking photographs so that nobody else could see that we were breaking the restrictions. This is one of my favourites. Hoppestad Stave Church is another early one. It sits on the floor of a fairly wide valley close to the fjord. The copper beach shows that it's in a mild microclimate. Beaches usually struggle in Norway, and the copper form is very sensitive to the cold winters. There's a replica of this particular Stave Church now in Minnesota, of all places. But the church was heavily restored in the 1880s. This is what it looked like before the architect and scholar Blix got to work. And here it is. He is now making it look like a proper Stave Church, as he thought they ought to be. And so you've now got a roof adorned with dragons, but the turrets and dragons were not there before his restoration. Around the church is an ambulatory, probably used for processions, especially at Passiontide and Easter. And so the doors into the church, the west doorway, has got some spectacular carvings around it, and they are actually very, very tall. The doorways into the church are nearly 12 feet high. Here we are inside, and we've actually got a painting of the interior as it was before Hans Blix got to it, when there were 3 levels in the church with 2 galleries and a lot of medieval painting, which Hans Blix actually had removed during his restoration. There were also pews in the church then. And here we are looking up. Daylight is very, very limited in Stave churches. Light comes in through just a few small porthole style windows just below the roof. The canopy on the northern side of the altar dates from the 1200s, although the painting may be slightly later. The inside of the canopy is lavishly decorated with painted angels and the Christmas story. And here I have unfolded it so that you can see the Christmas pictures laid out in order. Perhaps the most famous Stave church is the one of Borgund. It's one of the most iconic Stave churches. Like Hoppestad, it's actually been very heavily restored, although its dragons are probably the ones, models for the ones that Blix put on Hopperstad. And at least one of the dragons here is medieval. One thing is very different about this church, the belfry. Here it's a totally separate building to house the bells. On the left, you can see it undergoing restoration one time that we visited, and when we came back again, the restoration of the belfry had been completed. Again, we have got some fabulous carvings around the doorway, and we're looking through from the west door here towards the altar. And it's a stone altar inside there. And again, the spectacular medieval wooden furnishings. I love the toothy grin on the wood bolt on the inside. And here we are once again looking up into the roof timbers, where you can see faces are carved at the tops of some of the staves. Now I'm coming to two churches which were lost and found. This is another real favourite of mine, the church at Hedalen, which dates from about 1160. Unlike most of the Stave churches, this one is still a lively parish church and not a museum. But its story is absolutely wonderful. When the Black Death reached Norway, everybody in this isolated community died. It was not uncommon, but few places were as isolated from the outer world as Hedalen. And the place was totally lost from memory for about 300 years. After the Reformation, a huntsman in the woods was loosing an arrow and was terrified by the sound of a clanging noise that ensued. Although he didn't realize it, he had hit a bell in the separate belfry. So he returned on the following day with his friends and found this perfectly preserved medieval church, which had entirely missed out on the Reformation. One change that had to be made to this church was to the west door. After the catastrophic fire at Grua Stave Church, the door, because it opened inwards, what they did was they actually turned the doorway round so that the door would actually open outwards. And at the same time, they replaced the old door with a more modern one, but they retained some of the medieval ironwork. But then when you come into the church, you can see that much of it is log construction rather than stave construction, but the core of the church itself is stave. And there are some wonderful early medieval gems. The soapstone font dates from 1100, and its wooden cover dates from about 1200. The paint on the font is original. The cover was to prevent the water from freezing in winter. One of the gems of the church is this stunning early 13th century Madonna of English workmanship. For a time, she was removed from the church as it was felt that she belonged in a national museum. But after some years, the parishioners managed to persuade the authorities to return her. The altar shows an odd mismatch. The crucifix is 14th century and a beautiful piece of work. It is mounted against an altarpiece which was once the shrine of the Madonna. In a fit of misguided Protestant zeal, the figures of the saints which it once contained were removed, and the whole was overpainted with rosemarling sometime in the 1760s. The pinnacle of the shrine was removed but not destroyed, and that's the pinnacle that you have on the right-hand side. And beside that pinnacle, there is a bier to carry this reliquary, which was obviously carried in procession at various times of the year. Now, this is an outstanding reliquary. Thomas à Becket, you've got, it shows the martyrdom of Thomas à Becket. And he was a very, very popular saint in Norway. There are actually rather more churches dedicated to Thomas à Becket in Norway than there are in England. This is another church which was lost and then found, but in a slightly different way. Today, as you drive along the road, there is this white wooden church which was built in 1871. But the timbers of an earlier stave church were stored under the floor, and they were rediscovered during renovations in 1935, and the stave church was actually re-erected in 1965. It began life in 1180, a few hundred yards further down the hill from its present site. However, as the climate warmed in the late 1200s, the level of the lake rose, and this meant that corpses were beginning to float out of their graves in the churchyard. Now, an advantage of stave construction is that it's essentially flat pack, so they simply took it down and re-erected it on higher ground. Scroll on in time to about 1800, when the new laws meant that the church had to hold 2/3 of the local population for meetings. So they simply took down the old one and stored the timbers of the stave church under the floor of the new church that was built. Another fabulous stave church is one at Long, which was where those archaeologists were doing their experiments about 15 years ago. And here there's an incredible manuscript dated 1225. This again is a hymn to Thomas à Becket, which was found during archaeological investigations in 1973. And the last time we came here, there was a wedding going on. Many of the guests were wearing their traditional bunads, and the couple left in a carriage drawn by a fjell pony. Another stave church of interest. Here we've got a print dated 1701, and you can see that there are no dragons on the roof here at Flesburg. But in the churchyard around it, it's full of these tall stones with names on them. They're not actually gravestones, but represent the private parking places for local farmers to tether their horses while attending services. This stave church here at Fairness is the one that we've most recently visited only last month. And this is probably the last built original stave church. Dendrochronology shows that some of the staves were actually built, date from 1693, but it was clearly built on the site of an earlier church because the fabulous altarpiece is 150 years earlier than the church.
Hmm?
Now, this is another church which has moved an awful long way. Vang, which was, I've got a drawing here of it from the 1830s, but the local council decided to pull down the stave church, and after many shenanigans, it was sold to the Crown Prince of Prussia. All the pieces were carefully marked and packed for transportation to a site in a remote village in Silesia. And this is what the church looks like today. This is actually the most visited stave church in the world, but it's nothing like the original. The people, the carpenters who'd rebuilt it had never seen a stave church, and they didn't follow the excellent drawings which had been provided to them. So they reconstructed it in the way that they thought that a church ought to look like. The doorways are spectacular, even if they've actually not necessarily been put in the right way round. I just love the smiling cat on the top of that doorpost. So a chocolate box ending. This church, once at Garmo, has now been relocated to the Myhogan Museum, building museum in the east of Norway. But I have just hit my 50-minute deadline, so I hope that you have really enjoyed. Now I need to stop sharing my screen. And you are all able to unmute yourselves. And if you have any questions, I would be delighted to answer them.
So, thank you so much. It's been an absolutely wonderful talk. And I think everybody's learned a great deal from it. So are there any questions? You can probably just wave your hand, or you can go to the chat box and do it. So are there anybody? Or if not, there's just 40 of us, so you can speak up. Yeah, there you are, Sylvia. Yeah, Sylvia.
Hello. It was absolutely wonderful presentation, and I've learned such a lot because I don't know much about stave churches at all. But could you just expand a bit about the devastation with the metal? I didn't quite catch all you said about the devastation that had to do with the metal.
On the door. Sorry, are you thinking about the way that the doors had been worn and where you had got